Featherstone was deeply beloved by all who knew him. He was the first African-American graduate of Gettysburg College and later earned degrees from Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg and Harvard Divinity School. He was deeply involved in the Conference of International Black Lutherans, lovingly known as CIVL, and his ministry extended globally through mission work in Africa and also in South America. He retired from here in 2001 as Professor Emeritus as Cross-Cultural Theological Studies and Mission. Reverend Dr. Featherstone's legacy of faith, of scholarship, and advocacy endures in the many lives he touched. And I'm happy to welcome Gabriel Budacek up at this time to say a few words so that we can have a moment of remembrance for him. Gabriel, are you available? Thank you so much. Let's give guys a good
I feel like there will be a bit of redundancy here in what was pronounced. But Rudolph, also known as Rudy, was one of 8 children born to parents James and Annie Featherstone on December 26, 1934. And he was born and raised in Washington, D.C. Rudolph Richard Featherstone, he always made a big R there when he wrote his name. An ordained pastor, described himself as a janitor for Jesus, followed his calling as a faithful, unwavering, and obedient child of God. He attended Gettysburg College in the 1950s and was the first African American to graduate from Gettysburg College and was the only African American on the campus for his first 2 years of college. He is a graduate of Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg and a 1972 graduate of Harvard Divinity School. Following his graduation from Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg, he served as pastor for 10 years at St. John's Lutheran Church in the Bronx, New York, Incarnation Lutheran in Jamaica, New York, and Good Shepherd Lutheran in Detroit. Through his work as pastor, he strengthened the relationship African Americans had with the Lutheran Church and local congregations. Featherstone was a powerful preacher as well as teacher throughout his career. After graduating from Howard Divinity School, he served in campus ministry at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology as a mentor to students of color. His presence on campus led him to a position as professor at Trinity Lutheran Seminary, Bexley, Ohio. And here, he taught cross-cultural theological studies and mission. And among the courses he taught was the theology of Martin Luther King Jr. And in instruction and preaching, his powerful voice mimicked the voice of Dr. King. Throughout his entire career, Featherstone was dedicated to advocating for African American Lutherans. And Featherstone, with other ELCA teaching theologians of African descent, was involved in the Conference of International Black Lutherans, CIVL, and spoke at commencements, presentations, convocations, including a Founders Day convocation at California Lutheran University in Thousand Oaks, California. His publications and presentations include The Legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., A Tri-Dimensional Reality and Symbol, and Human Dignity in the Thought of Martin Luther King Jr. He embarked on numerous travels with African American colleagues in ministry to the continent of Africa and also South America as a servanthood commitment to mission and ministry abroad. On a light note, true to Rudy's character and humility, it was published once in the Columbus Dispatch local newspaper that he was the janitor at Trinity Lutheran Seminary. Following his self-introduction as janitor for Jesus, during an interview of another professor in college and ministry here at Trinity. Following his passing of his beloved wife, Carmela, Dr. Featherstone established the Carmela Walker Featherstone Memorial Endowment Fund. It is a scholarship held by the EOCA, providing for the studies of preferential African American women studying for Christian Word and Sacrament, or studying for post-MDiv academic work at Trinity Lutheran Seminary. The endowment scholarship reads, "The fund is intended as an expression of our thanksgiving and stewardship, with the hope that the ministries of Jesus Christ will be strengthened and extended in the life of this church. May his legacy continue to live on with this gift, and in his words, be a blessing to others in the name of Jesus Christ, as we have been blessed in his name." The family of Reverend Dr. Featherstone wishes to thank you for Rudy's recognition at the 33rd Annual Nelson W. Trout Lectureship. Reverend Dr. Rudolph Richard Featherstone, preacher, teacher, man of integrity, grace, humility, child of God, and of course, janitor for Jesus. Amen. Amen.
Gabriel, thank you so much for that remembrance, so that we can just have those moments to remember how much he meant to this place and the impact that he had on the students here and continues to have. So thank you. We will have another selection from the musicians, and then we will begin to get started with our lecture. I'll come up and walk through a couple of points, and then we'll have our lecture introduced. Thank you.
It's good to know that we are free to worship, free to give the Lord glory in any way that we express, whether it's lifting up our hands, opening up our mouth. I'm so glad to know that he's good to me, and we worship him today. We give you glory, Lord. You are wonderful, God.
Oh!
God, truly, truly blessed to be able to worship and to be able to worship with such wonderful music. Thank you so much. Amen. So before we introduce our keynote speaker, there were a couple of things about the facility and about accessibility that I want to make sure that you know. You can enter and exit the building either through these doors or from the ground floor, if that's easier for you. There are restrooms on the ground floor, this floor, and the floor upstairs, all in the same location, down the hall and across from the elevators. There are refreshments, as you see, on this floor, and we'll have that this afternoon and also tomorrow morning for our early meet and greet before the second talk. Our meals, dinner this evening, and the closing luncheon will be served downstairs in the fellowship hall, promptly named Koinonia, for those of you who remember your biblical Greek. And if you like to do the stairs, that's the fastest way up and down, but you can also take the elevator if that's easiest for you. And as we begin, we ask that you please silence your cell phones so that we are all here in this space together. And at this time, I would like to welcome Dean Kleinhans back up to introduce our speaker. Kip, please. Thank you.
It is my great privilege today to be able to introduce our guest speaker and preacher of this evening's worship service, Reverend Dr. Teresa L. Smallwood. Lutherans have a lot to say about the relationship between law and gospel. And although Dr. Smallwood is not herself Lutheran, she is the embodiment of this intersection of law and gospel, as someone who holds both law and theology degrees. Teresa was born and raised in Windsor, North Carolina, in a rural community with her mother, father, and extended family. She says she grew up Baptist in a community that really leaned into the idea that it takes a village to raise a child. After high school, she enrolled in the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where she earned a Bachelor of Arts in Speech Communications and Afro-American Studies. And from there, she went on to North Carolina Central University School of Law, where she obtained her Juris Doctorate. She began her legal career with Legal Services of the Southern Piedmont in Charlotte, North Carolina, where she also works as staff attorney for the Children's Law Center. She served for 2 years as an assistant district attorney and then established a private practice in law that spanned 2 decades. And then, because God never stops calling us, she, like Dr. Featherstone before her, ended up at the Howard University School of Divinity, where she earned a Master of Divinity degree and then moved on to Chicago Theological Seminary to earn a PhD. She was licensed and ordained to public ministry while serving at Mount Olive Missionary Baptist Church in Lewiston, North Carolina, and has served in several other congregations of several different Christian traditions. She has taught at, it's an impressive list, Lancaster Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, the Religious Freedom Center in Washington, D.C., Chicago Theological Seminary in Chicago, and Philander Smith College in Little Rock, Arkansas. Before coming to United Lutheran Seminary in 2021, she served for 4 years as the postdoctoral fellow and associate director of the Public Theology and Racial Justice Initiative at Vanderbilt Divinity School. I will not do justice to the field of public theology. She can tell you much more, but my nickel explanation is public theology is the commitment that theology is not just for the church, but for the world. is no surprise then that when she came to United Lutheran Seminary in 2021, she was hired as the James Franklin Kelly and Hope Eister Kelly Associate Professor of Public Theology. While at United, she shaped and is now the director of a new PhD program in public theology and witness, and has now for almost a year been serving as Dean and Vice President of Academic Affairs. As we were planning for this event last summer already, we knew that this was an interesting time in public life in the United States, and it would become more interesting. Without knowing yet last summer and last fall how our national elections would go, we became convinced, or perhaps I should say I was convinced and convinced the rest of the planning committee, that Dr. Smallwood would have a word for us regardless of the election and the outcome, or the outcome of the election, and regardless of where we find ourselves now. Let me share just one quotable quote before you get to hear from her herself. She is, along with Emily Towns and Christoph Ringer, an editor of a volume called Moved by the Spirit, Religion and Movement for Black Lives. Her own chapter in that volume is called Their Words Became Flesh, which is a reflection on the Black Lives Matter movement. And she offers this succinct message. What does it mean for Black lives to matter? To make the claim that Black lives matter, one is tapping into a mystical structure established, I contend, by the Incarnation. The theological implication is that in the human condition, the life of Black people matters to God, and consequently, Black lives should matter to every other creature. I've had the joy of working with Dr. Smallwood and some theological education networks, and I'm really excited to welcome her here so that we can all hear from her work as a scholar. Please join me in welcoming the Reverend Dr. Teresa L. Smallwood.
I would like to thank you all for being present, and I most definitely need to say a thank you for the exceptional hospitality that I have experienced. I want to speak very candidly that Mary Ann and Darryl have shown me the love that I want to bring forth in all of the presentations that I'm thinking about. I've come to the conclusion, even though I will tell you I am unapologetically Black, I've come to the conclusion that God made us the way God made us so that we could understand the mosaic image of God. There's more than one color, more than one people. God has prepared for all the nations to be of one blood. And it makes me happy to be in a space where I know people understand that, right? We have been, I think, in our experiences in America in particular, but really all over the globe, we've been, thank you so much, brother. We have been made to think of ourselves in ways that cause us to not love others. And I cannot tell you how blessed I feel to have been here when Dr. Featherstone was being acknowledged, because Dr. Featherstone fits right into the same paradigm as the two people I came to talk about. We would do well to raise the glass to the memory of Nelson W. Trout, And I'm wanting to bring a little bit of light to Daniel Alexander Payne. I know that on the program it says E, and it might have been a mistake of mine that was made and carried on, but it's Daniel A. Payne. And I think that when you begin to see the caliber of man, when you begin to make the connection between people who didn't know each other, but who are operating in a particular spirit, then you'll get me, because what I'm really talking about is public theologian with prophetic witness. And I'm calling it Daniel A. Payne, public theologian with prophetic witness. But I'm using the example of Nelson Wesley Trout to think about that, to think about what the importance of such a statement might be in a moment like this. It behooves us all to recognize that if the people of God don't rise up, there's a lot to be said about what the devil have done when they rise up. And so the question about prophetic witness, coupled with this idea of a public theologian, is really where I'm going to park myself. Now, Nelson Strobert, Professor Emeritus in Religious Education at United Lutheran Seminary, he is still living actually in Gettysburg, wrote the seminal biography of Daniel Alexander Payne. And he characterizes Payne as the venerable preceptor of the AME Church, African Methodist Episcopal Church. I happen to be AME. And in that statement, Nelson is essentially saying that Payne, in his work, in his life, in the way in which he presented himself in the world, he brought about the significance of education to some degree, but the significance of being a strong churchman in the concept of an African Methodist Episcopal Church. Now, I would say that Payne's connection with Lutheranism, particularly his presence in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the same as with others who've been named, as the first African American to attend Lutheran Theological Seminary in Gettysburg, which is now where I serve, United Lutheran Seminary, offers a less celebrated but equally important contribution to the work of racial equity in America. Payne's example aligns with the named honorific of the Trout lectures, Reverend Dr. Nelson Wesley Trout, in that both men were pioneers in leadership and innovation in community building and academic excellence. This particular talk will highlight their legacies as instructive for our current times. The first time that I read about Trout was a reposting that Kit did in 2020 around, I think it was the Living Lutheran. And in that article it said the American Lutheran Church, a 2.3 million member denomination formed largely of Scandinavian immigrants, elected its first black bishop. Now I know you all know how absolutely important that was. But can you imagine that in the year he was named, he in the 80s was the only black person to be named a bishop. And how many years did we wait to Pat Davenport come along? Okay. Now he led a district that covered California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, Hawaii, and portions of Texas. Well, you know those states. He didn't have an easy job. 144,000 members. And he, of course, relocated to California. It's probably the best place for him to be. But this was after he had served as executive director of the Lutheran Social Services in Dayton and had been elected on the third ballot. Now, you Lutherans know what that means. I don't have a clue. And this article says that basically it was a unit that elected him to be this, and it made national news. I think that's very significant. And of course, in the article, there is mention of his background, but it doesn't take up the issue that in 1968, after the 67 riots that happened in Detroit, it was Nelson Wesley Trout who reflected on the condition of the world from his social vocation. And in that instance, he wrote this. This past summer, I visited Detroit, Newark, Chicago, Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and New York. One more part right there and say, he probably did that on his own dime. He goes on to say, it was interesting to note the unique character which marked the problem in each place. When you think about it, I would venture a guess that some of those same problems still exist. Now he says, for instance, in Detroit, I found people more or less unwilling to talk about the riot, which had happened July 23rd through 28th of 1967. In fact, they went about as if nothing had happened. At the site of much of the bombing, I found little children contentedly playing in the rubble. Adults walked by without as much as turning a head. He went on to say, as I traveled about the country, it appeared to me that the judgment of history is being executed in the streets of our cities. America is learning that you cannot violate God or neighbor with impunity. Let me just say, America was supposed to learn that. But I'm not sure we got the lesson. In the words of Gerald Revert, it's time for us to be a pupil. Because God is definitely our teacher. And I'm thinking that America has an F right now in the class of how to handle humanity. He said every ghetto in America is a solemn sign of the cumulative yet deliberate sins of flesh against flesh, of humanity against humanity, and yes, of Americans against America and Americans. He said at the site of much of the bombing, people were just absolutely happenstance. And in his movement, he found that people were comparing human beings and the growth of human beings to the growth of a mighty oak. But he said, you know, a mighty oak can't be built in a 2-gallon pail. Either the oak will be stunted and will eventually wither and die from the lack of sustenance, or else its roots will be burst through. And the limitations found in the soil to which they will grow and expand. The analogy is not exact, he says, but it does rightly suggest that the seeking, searching, inspiring spirit cannot be confined. It must be free to achieve the fullest possibilities. And so it was that he was reflecting on the our theological work in light of the societal problems that we see. But as he reflected, he constantly came back to the fact that we're agents of God. We're the image of God. And we are to handle God's humanity in a different way than what we're doing. Public theology as a discipline is relatively new. Martin E. Marty, recently deceased luminary at the University of Chicago, is credited with introducing the concept of a public church. Many scholars over the last 50 years have added to its understanding. And when we teach students at United Lutheran Seminary the introduction course to public theology, we're teaching them to understand that we immerse them in the theoretical framework of public theology as a theological telos, in which the quest for social, racial, economic, and legal justice requires of its proponents the development of programs to address a common public life. Now that phraseology, a common public life, comes from Linnell E. Cady, who wrote a book about this idea of public theology. And we're thinking in terms of a common public life for all of God's children, for all citizens. While centering the role of faith in seeking to address and eradicate injustices faced by multiracial members in our society, we emphasize the role of prophetic activism and prophetic imagination. Many of you will know that terminology, prophetic imagination, from Walter Brueggemann. But prophetic activism is just what it sounds like. God is moving you to do something. Thus, the lens of public theology, defined broadly, is to include wide publics and pluralistic knowledges of theological grounding. Well, what do I mean, pluralistic groundings? You know, when I was growing up in the Baptist church, it wasn't hard for you to know that Baptist was the only way, because they would put down everybody else. But I don't believe that's godly. I believe the godly way is to acknowledge that God will reveal God's self through whatever mechanism God desires. And we should have the respect for God that allows us to receive this God in everyone. When we think about this sort of broad definition, we have to recognize that presently there's a critical need for training newly minted and often young leaders to enter the discourse on justice on all fronts. But I want to make clear that I'm not talking about the world's justice, because our criminal court system, criminal so-called justice system is hardly just for a lot of people. I'm speaking of God's justice. And if I had another lecture tacked on to the two I'm doing, I would break that down for you. But the bottom line is, understand that God's justice is very different from what we are practicing in the world. So what we mean then is that when you think in terms of provoking students to examine and critique social practices and cultural understandings, we're literally trying to teach people that you can't even be a public theologian if you don't have cultural competence to know who it is you're speaking to. Because if you're not competent, you will say something that will turn them off, and then there will be no way for what you have to say to make any kind of change, any kind of transformation in that life. So we hope that our students will learn to identify a justice platform that resists the tensions that are clear in this world and bring forth the kinds of shifts in paradigms as it relates to racism, sexism, economic violence, societal systems, because really and truly all of the societal systems have an overlay of a kind of enslavement mentality. And so it is then that we expect our students to take race and class and address it theoretically through these sociological and historical and theological readings that we give them. In essence, then, that is what I mean by public theology. Now, as it relates to Daniel Alexander Payne, this is a painting that hangs right outside my door in my office at United Lutheran. This is him for the first time meeting Samuel Simon Smucker, who was the person who basically broke down all kinds of walls when it comes to race. And Smucker is the one who founded Gettysburg College and then subsequently founded the Lutheran Seminary at Gettysburg. But when it comes to looking at Daniel Alexander Payne, he wrote an autobiography. And it was entitled Recollection of 70 Years, and that he was saying he was born to free parents in Charleston, South Carolina on the 24th of February, 1811. Now think about that. He was born to free parents in Charleston, South Carolina in 1811. We didn't get the Emancipation Proclamation until, what, 50 years later, 54 years later? His parents, Martha and London Payne, were members of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Both parents died when Payne was but a young boy. I think his mother died when he was 4, his father died when he was 9, so he was picked up by an aunt who raised him. And he worked at the age of 13 to learn carpentry. And this is what he says in his biography. It was during the time that I was in carpenter's shop that I came into possession of the first number of what was then known as the Self-Interpreting Bible by Reverend John Brown of Haddington, Scotland. It was prefaced with a biographical sketch of this great man. The reading of this became the turning point of my life, for after reading it, I came to the conclusion to try and be what he was. I said to myself, if Brown learned Latin, Greek, and Hebrew without a living teacher, why can't I? This question was answered by our tribe. Up to that hour, I had never seen a book in Latin, Greek, or Hebrew, but I resolved, as soon as I could get them to study, while I would read every book within my reach, among which was the Scottish Chiefs. Then at 18 years of age, Payne converted, having devoted himself to prayer in his youth. And this is a conversion that happens with the Methodist Church. And then he wrote, God heard our songs of praise. And let me just say, gracious in the morning. Hallelujah for the gifts in the house. Hallelujah. He says, God heard our songs of praise, our prayers of faith, poured out his awakening and converting power. Listen to this. It poured out his awakening and converting power upon his waiting children, and many souls were converted and sanctified by it. Of this number I was one. Here too I gave him my whole heart, and instantly felt that peace which passeth all understanding, and that joy which is unspeakable and full of glory. He goes on to say, it was in that moment I set apart myself to educate myself in order that I might educate others. And he speaks of this as being an inclination of the Holy Spirit. I hope you're getting where I'm coming from. As it relates to Payne, his thirst for a means to educate his people is undeniable. He was relentless in his self-taught consciousness. Once he realized the value of education to form one's worldview, he was convinced that it should be the right of all people to learn. And this was a fundamental value of Daniel Alexander Payne. Education became Payne's prophetic witness, and when he encountered a world that vehemently sought to stop him from educating others, his first school, of course, opened in 1829 with 3 children and 3 adults. The tuition was 50 cents per pupil per month. And he faced widespread opposition. Finally, he had to close the school due to, get this kid, legal maneuvers. But his commitment to educate the people never waned. He went on to further educate himself and reopened his school and continued the trend towards educating Black people as a lifelong endeavor. Now, I want to focus Payne in connection with Trout, because both of them spent their lives, you understand? Trout spent his life committed to educating people. And I want to say that there is absolutely no better convention, no better vocation, no better opportunity to spread the love and justice of God than to open people's minds, to open people's minds, to open people's minds. Concern for people, not Black people, not white people, not BIPOC people, but people as a whole. That's the concept by which many scholars, and particularly the scholars we're thinking about, because understand, if white folks hadn't opened their doors and arms, Payne would not have been able to be at that school. And can I just stop and say to you that when we think in terms of people like W.E.B. Du Bois, who was dealing with the concept of the Negro problem, that's because he was in the midst of a Harvard education and he heard his own professor had written an article in the Atlantic Quarterly. And that article by Nathaniel Southgate Shaler is what wrote the terminology, the Negro problem. And it was W.E.B. Du Bois's insistence that he meet that statement. And it ends up being an important essay in the souls of Black folks. Now, Shaler writes in 1888, I do believe, and his article appears, and it wasn't just Du Bois who took up this issue of the Negro problem. What does it mean to be a problem? Du Bois obviously did his work in a very scholarly manner, but let me tell you, there were others. Paul Laurence Dunbar took it up. He took it up in his aesthetics. Others took up that issue, and the next thing you know, there was a whole volume printed about what the Negro wants. So many of our ancestors were convicted that if we act like white folks, maybe they'll accept us. And you can talk all you want to all day long about whether or not that was a right premise. But the truth of the matter is they were thinking, critical thinking people who at the very least understood what it meant to get out of the trouble that causes them to be a problem. And the bottom line for me is that they weren't just thinking of themselves. They had the whole community on their hearts and minds. What does it mean for all of us to escape the dead clothes, the clothes of the dead folks, and become people who have been renewed by the promises of God? They felt all of them, all of these 3 men that we talked about and heard about today. They understood that if people could be educated, they wouldn't be a problem. I still believe it. But concern for the whole people was not a concept that everybody agreed upon. In fact, when Shaler wrote his article, he was suggesting that because people emancipated, we got a problem. Because now they know they're human. Now they know they have the same rights as everybody else. Now they know. And very soon they will try to operate in a particular freedom. And I'm not sure we want that. Now I want you to take, for instance, someone like Reinhold Niebuhr. Reinhold Niebuhr wrote a book, Moral Man and Immoral Society, a study in ethics and politics. The book is described this way: Moral Man and Immoral Society is his important work in ethics and politics. Forthright, realistic, it discusses the inevitability of social conflict, talks about the brutal behavior of human collectives. And of course, Reinhold Niebuhr was what many would call the Protestant pastor, the theologian who everybody wanted to hear from, including Mike Wallace, who has if you Google him or either go on YouTube, you'll see a dynamite experience there that they had in terms of an interview. But there was a vicious cycle of injustice, and it rang true as a perennial problem. Niebuhr was one of the foremost voices of his time. In 1932, when he printed this particular book, he spoke of the incessant nature that always results in inequalities and injustices. The bottom line, however, is that just like Marvin McNichol, I've been asking the question, where are all the prophets? Seems to me the prophetic activism that we need has died. And I will say to you, when Niebuhr wrote this comment, he says, while it is possible for intelligence to increase the range of benevolent impulse and thus prompt a human being to consider the needs and rights of others, or other than those to whom he is bound by organic and physical relationship, there are definite limits in the capacity of ordinary mortals, which makes it impossible for them to grant to others what they claim for themselves. And this is the most prolific writer, the most prolific theologian at the time, saying, wait a minute, surely they should have some rights, but we can't just give them everything. And this is why, if you've read James Hal Combs' book, The Cross and the Lynching Tree, this is why Combs gives such a direct critique of Niebuhr. Niebuhr is really a progressive thinker in his moment. But even he is saying, listen, just wait a little while. Everything you want, you'll get, just be patient. Yeah. And Combs makes a comparison of the plight of African Americans, particularly in the lynching era. And he compares it to Jesus' experience on the cross as a symbolic lynch. And speaking of America's racist history, particularly as it finds expression in America's racist violence, Combs draws parallels. In his second chapter of the book, Combs takes Niebuhr on by stating the obvious in terms of Niebuhr's assessment of morality. And when he considers the cross and the redemptive suffering within his writings, Combs is saying, you didn't ever really think to mention lynching? Combs accuses Niebuhr of an inability to name the real issues, racism and racially motivated violence. And so Combs reflects on what he writes in The Cross and the Lynching Tree, but he also reflects on it in his final manuscript that was written or really published posthumously. Are you familiar with that? That's his book, Said It Wasn't Gonna Tell Nobody, The Making of a Black Theologian. In this book, he says, in my chapter on Reinhold Niebuhr, America's most important Christian social ethicist of the 20th century, I expose Niebuhr's blindness to black oppression, his tacit complicity with it. Slavery, segregation, lynching find little or no place in Niebuhr's theological reflections or that of any other white theologian. Yes, Niebuhr had little empathy for the lesser races subjugated by white colonialists. He claimed that North America was a virgin continent, when the Anglo-Saxons came and with a few Indians in a primitive state of culture. Niebuhr saw America as divinely destined to expand into an empire, and he wrote about Arabs, Palestine, and people of color in the Third World in the same way as he wrote about Indians, offering moral justification for colonialism. And you realize there are still pieces of art hanging up in our very pristine museums right now that call Indians all kinds of names. And that is because Indians and African Americans were placed in a particular cadre of thought. The Indians were called savages. You'll see that in some of the art. The title savage will be there. Black people were called beasts. But Cone provides a view of theology that is all too hauntingly clear. And it's clear that the lived experience of both Trout and Daniel Alexander Payne, who lived almost 100 years apart, it's very clear to me that it signals an important thing for us to lift from these lives that have been lived for the purposes of God's justice. And that we are to lift, I do believe, is in the same vein as Martin Luther in his very important work as a reformist. It's hard for me to believe that Martin Luther stood up against the whole church, wrote what he thought and planted it on the doorsteps of the church. Do you know what kind of gravitas it takes? What kind of, well, you know what I would say. You know what it takes to be able to stand up and say, you are wrong, church. What happened to that Protestant thought? You understand, that is what prophetic activism is all about. To be able to discern truth from lie. Do you realize that truth has been placed on trial in America? Truth needs some witnesses. And I submit to you that Daniel Alexander Payne and all of the men that have been listed, but most particularly Nelson Wesley Trout, Dr. Featherstone, these were men who understood what it meant to stand up and be counted among those who will fight for truth. And the truth is, people need to be educated, because in education is freedom. And it never stopped. In his recollections of 70 years, he talks about what it meant to have to leave school because he looked at the eclipse with a bare eyes and lost some of his sight, but he kept on planting himself until, you know what, he connected with the AMEs, and not only did he become the bishop, but we're going to find out that he also became the president of Wilberforce. When you think about Trout and Payne, they're both bishops, both, one is Lutheran, one is AME, but they both have experiences in the Lutheran church. Both are advocating for black liberation. Really and truly, Payne is advocating for everybody's liberation, and so is Trout. Because you see where he was teaching, right? And they served with distinction. But the bottom line is they regarded theological education as a tool for freedom. I heard the sister say that she's about to get her PhD. I'm going to put on a shameless plug and say I'm wanting as many of us as can possibly get it. I heard you, Bob. As many of us as can possibly get it. Become PhDs so you can go and teach the rest. We've got a PhD program at ULS. Tuition is free. a life when you have lived in such a way that your works speak for you. When I was growing up, we used to sing a song, let the works I've done speak for me. Pain of all the people in the world has a marker, a banner right on Washington Street there in Gettysburg. Talks about him being born a free African, even though his parents were free. His father was later 12 years a slave. You know that story, right? That happened to his father, even though he was completely free. But the bottom line is he came, he stayed there for 2 years. In 1837, he left as a student, but he became a historian for the enemy church and later became the president of Wilberforce. Now I want you to understand, both of them came at a time, they were born at a time when America was still trying to figure out what it meant to be American. But with Trout, the Red Summer happened 2 years before he was born. So he was born into chaos. You all know that the Red Summer was a time and an event in America in which, let's just face it, they were doing what they call mass, really just mass race riots all over the country. In Arkansas, Elaine, Arkansas, massacres. In Florida, in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Just bad. And there's something that Cameron McWhirter does in his book, right about the summer of 1919 and the awakening. There's something about the way in which those massacres occurred that it awakened black folks to the point where we understood that, listen, we gotta fight a fight. But the same held true for Daniel Payne. And even in the midst of that, though, Daniel Payne continued to win the love and respect of those that he worked with. Because do you not know that Samuel Simon Smucker, who had to leave his own home during the Civil War because they were ready to put him down because he was helping black folks, he had to flee Gettysburg. But at a point in time, well before, of course, in 1837, when Payne was about to leave because he couldn't continue with his education, this is what Smucker wrote him. Back then, if you had a note from someone who was considered high up, it would carry you places and open doors for you that you wouldn't necessarily have otherwise. This is the note that Samuel Simon Smucker wrote Daniel Payne. He said to Mr. D.A. Payne, as you are about to leave the institution in which for about 2 years you have been pursuing a course of study preparatory to the holy ministry, it affords me unfeigned pleasure to testify that the effect of our daily intercourse during this time has been unwavering confidence in the integrity of your purposes and the excellence of your character, together with the conviction that the God, who of one blood made all nations to dwell upon the face of the earth, will accompany you through life and crown with his blessings your labors in behalf of your oppressed kinsmen after the flesh. Let the precious promises of that God, who hears the cries of the oppressed and has predicted Ethiopia's enlargement, encourage you to aim at much and to let a humble and habitual reliance on his aid strengthen you for its performance. That the blessing of the divine Savior, who has promised to be with us always, may richly abide with you, is the prayer of your friend and brother in Christ, S.S. Smucker. Well, my point in reading that little piece is to say relationality makes every bit of difference.
And when you have built relationship across race and class and all the other isms that we have, we find ways to be civil with one another, to understand that our difference is not something that makes us lose something, but difference is a value add. And I can appreciate what you bring to the table, and you can appreciate what I bring to the table, and we all can live together. The comparison that I've made of these two exceptional scholars reveals the dichotomy in which both Trout and Powell found themselves. While both were first, in many ways they had a mandate on their lives to offer opportunities to others, to bridge the wealth gap, to provide for their families, to raise their children in the reverence and admiration and admonition of God. And they were faced in very different epochs of history with very similar exigencies. Powell was born in 1811. And I dare say, when he wrote a piece called Slavery Brutalizes Man, that took some guts. But he wrote it. He had been, at that time, ordained in the Franklin Synod of the Lutheran Church. And his speech was delivered in the Smallwood report. And he took a stand flat-footed before the president and said, listen, I move the adoption of this report because it is based upon the following proposition. American slavery brutalizes man. It destroys his moral agency and subverts the moral government of God. And sir, I am opposed to slavery, not because it enslaves the black man, but because it enslaves all men. And in that same vein, I must say, Trout was born just after that period that I said, Red Summer, between 1919 and 1921. And when he was born, there was a lot of unrest and violence in America. 23 major races, major races, 30,000 people dead. It was war. And I want to know, do you see any semblance of alliance in the experiences of these men? Do you understand that we are right back where we started in a lot of different ways in America? When I was young, we sang a song that said, every round goes higher and higher. It was Jacob's ladder. We're climbing Jacob's ladder, it said. But every round goes higher and higher. What it was really saying is, in order to get to the top, you're going to keep going around, but you're going up, you're going up. The reality is, as you go around, the same old is happening. And it behooves us all to make sure that the paradigms are changed, that we figure out what it means to be a ladder and not a rotation, what it means to grow and not just stagnant. And I think that is what these men teach us. Bottom line is that despite all that was happening with the race riots, we also had in the 1920s time of great change. Opportunity for African Americans. This is when the Harlem Renaissance comes alive. It's in full swing with people like Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston and County Cullen. And I want you all to understand I am not a violent person. I don't proffer violence. But there's a sense in which people are just not going to take us so much. And back in the day of the Red Summer, you know what? Even the poets were writing in response. Claude McKay wrote this poem. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, haunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mark at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain. Even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us, though dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for those 1,000 blows, deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Let men, we'll face feel like the only thing they have is violence. And while I understand it and realize that the poem's core message is a call to resist oppression and fight for dignity, I still believe that the work of the master is a better paradigm to follow. I still believe that nonviolence is the way. I still believe that you cannot accomplish anything with violence, but more violence. But what I also know is that taken together, Trout and Payne were cut from the same cloth. They understood how our hands work together with God's power. I'm convinced of that. As I think about Daniel Payne and all the books that have been written, Daniel Payne, Great Black Leader by Rubin Sims Bishop, Daniel Payne, The Faithful Preacher, can't read that name. And Daniel Payne, the elected and consecrated bishop, 6th elected and consecrated bishop of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. And I think about Nelson W. Trout, the first bishop of the Lutheran Church. I'm saying to us point blank, the examples of indomitable dedication to the cause of Christ are sorely missing in this present epoch of history. And no one has documented the stories of Black Lutheran heroes and sheroes better than Dr. James R. Thompson. But notwithstanding that, we need people who are selfless and committed to healing of the whole nation, the whole people. People who are less concerned for the usual barriers and the usual binaries, black and white, male and female, all those binaries that mess us up a little bit. And are more concerned for a flourishing humanity. People who can stand flat-footed like Daniel Alexander Payne, Nelson Trout, and say, if I could learn it, so can you. If they could do it, so can we. If God gives us strength, so it will be. That, my friends, is prophetic witness. Now, a public theologian is someone who announces that proclamation and does so on behalf of all of humanity. Because public theologians and prophetic witness go hand in hand, just like Nelson W. Trout and Daniel Alexander Payne. Thank you.
Dr. Smallwood, thank you so very much. So very much. I wonder if we might entertain a question or two if we had some from the audience. Thank you. Does anyone have a question or comment for Dr. Smallwood's wonderful presentation that we've heard? We do have a couple of minutes for just a couple of questions. See, I'm new to the classroom, so I know to just wait this out. Dr. Marcos, please.
Thank you so much for this moment for a wonderful presentation, powerful presentation. It's so inspiring. You have mentioned how James H. Conn, besides believers blindness towards their life experience. And later, James H. Conn was criticized by various theologians how Conn was blind towards the intersectionality deep within the black experience. So I was wondering how Daniel was aware about the intersectionality when he was talking about education or justice. Was there a very general kind of justice, or how it was very about the intersectionality within Black experience. And without that intersectionality, without that womanist perspective, how we can talk about public theology?
A very astute question. If I understood you, I give Daniel Payne a great deal of space because of the era that he comes from and the understandings he had in his moment. Quite frankly, Payne was quite patriarchal. I would say, if you looked at some of his writings, you understood that he was kind of like Phyllis Wheatley in his writing. Phyllis Wheatley talked about us poor sinners and being knighted with, the capacity to be free. So intersectionality was not perhaps a part of their thinking, because they were very clear on the fact that we just need to hold our head down and say yasa. But in time, right, the notion of education has taken on a different life. Even in the African American experience more broadly. AMEs were probably some of the first, but it took them 200 years to make Jarena Lee posthumously an elder. So I guess what I'm saying to you is there wasn't anything about intersectionality that would have been a part of his thinking. And in terms of pain, a woman had her place, right? He may have understood very clearly the need for the whole people, but he saw wholeness as your man takes care of you, I would think. Does that make sense? Do you think I have responded to you appropriately? Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood. I have a question here.
Hi, you spoke about a lot of the likenesses that Payne and Dr. Trout had, but are there any notable differences that you came across in your research that form sort of like a mosaic? I heard you speaking about that in one of this lecture in regard to a mosaic and coming together to form a picture and to create something that's more complete.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the reasons I was led to bring this comparison is because so often, and this will come out more specifically in my lecture tomorrow, but so often even though we're celebrating a tremendous Black man, I'm choosing to do so understanding that Black folks and white folks had to work together in order for this thing we call freedom. I mean, if you think about Howard University being started by a white, general in the Union Army, then you understand that where I'm coming from is not to say that being Black isn't something I'm proud of. It's something I'm very proud of. But I'm also very aware that evolution takes on its own specifics, right? So the most obvious is that Payne ends up in a Black denominational fabric. But there's a whole lot of Methodism and a whole lot of Lutheranism in AME, Ecclesia, and liturgy. Right? And so when I think of the mosaic, I'm really saying, literally, like what we have in our windows in the churches. All of the colors, all of the pieces, because we all are basically a part of a broken piece, a brokenness in humanity. And it's that which creates that mosaic. It is that which allows us to appreciate that Mary was the first preacher. She carried the word. Amen.
Thank you. I have a question here.
Sure.
Thank you, Dr. Smallwood, for sharing with us. I'm curious of your insight of the double burden that goes with public theologians, because while active in the world, there's also the other side of that, of being active within one's denomination, within one's own family.
Thank you. You're so right. Double burden is a great way to put it too. But what I have begun to fashion in terms of my own definition of public theology is that you're never off. You're always on. In the grocery store you're on, in the church. This is still a public gathering. Even within the church, it's a public gathering. And in essence then, I'm saying we need to do what Luther did all the time, everywhere. Consider the fact. Would you just consider with me that maybe the church has gone off? Just a little bit off track? And if that is the case, then the proclamation has to happen everywhere and in all things. It should happen in the boardrooms where you know that more and more we are concerned about the capitalization of the church as opposed to the wholeness of the people. In other words, I don't even think the way we do church is what Jesus had in mind when he told people. He said, on this truth I will build my church. And the gates of hell will not prevail. I'm willing to tell you that when you think in terms of the uptick of white nationalism in this country and how it is using and deploying Christianity as a weapon, we got work to do, brother. And it is a burden. Yes, indeed, a double burden. Thank you all so much. Yes.
Thank you so much. Question from Dr. Thomas, please, and then we'll wrap up there.
Dr.
I
Smallwood,
can't answer his question.
thank you so much. You know, I struggled with Hebrew and I struggled with Greek, but Hebrew especially when I was in seminary. And when I read Daniel Plan's claim to have been self-taught Hebrew, and Haddington, who he thought very much of, I wondered about that. Can you say a little bit more about that, please?
So the book that Haddington wrote called Scottish Chiefs is what he was really concerned about. He thought that Haddington and the Scots gave him a great example about how to deliver the people. Haddington was his Moses. Haddington was the person who helped him theorize in his mind that there's another way. That despite the fact that my people are under tremendous oppression, the Scottish chiefs had a maneuver. They had a plan. They had strategy. And for all of the critiques I can have of the AME church, the way in which it has moved around the world, the way in which it has grown, and is now itself a 2.3 million member group, I would say that he embraced the best of that story. But I'm not sure he didn't ignore some other stories that could have been equally as helpful. But he didn't want to be this radical. He just wanted to be strategic. Because had he wanted to be a radical, he had another John Brown he could have looked for. There was a Denmark visa he could have thought about. There was some other folk who had a different paradigm. But just like we look at Martin Luther King and compare him to others, because they're more than just one radical that Martin has been kind of pitted up against. Both ways have some value. But in my estimation, and this is just my opinion, Malcolm could not have been my leader because I don't ascribe to violence. He was talking about, any means necessary. And if the means meant shooting a person, then, do it. But it was nonviolence that got us the Civil Rights Act. And so I'm saying then that in their errors, they sought to find the heroes they could, just like I have named you my hero. Because you've given, voice to those people who were truly prophetic in their actions, prophetic activists. And I'm thankful for it.
Another hand for Dr. Smallwood. Thank you for being so gracious to take those questions. Really appreciate that. So we are coming up on a break time now. We'll have a little bit of an extended break. At 4 o'clock, please come back in here. We are going to unveil the icon of Dr. Trout that was commissioned and made especially for this lecture series. So you have a little bit of extended time to have a snack and a cup of coffee. Maybe ask Dr. Smallwood another question after she has a break. Because she's very gracious to be with us and answer those extra questions. So you're dismissed for break, and we'll see you back here at 4. Thank you.